In this interview, I talked to Seane Corn. She's one of the most popular yoga teachers in the industry, with an impressive celebrity client list, including Sting and Madonna. Now, I was really excited to talk to Seane. She knows a thing or two about turning your life around. She went from waiting on tables and living dangerously to one of Hollywood's hottest yoga teachers. So I hope you enjoyed the interview. So with somebody who's just starting yoga for the very first time, what were they experiencing those first initial weeks?
Well, it depends on, are they a beginner student but they're very in their bodies and they do other forms of exercise? If that's the case, then they're probably going to experience, as they realign their muscular system and break some habits, general soreness, because they're using different muscles. They might find an increase in their energy. They might surprise themselves by how quickly their body adapts to the practice. If there's someone, though, who's never been in their body, who hasn't gotten off their couch in the last 20 years, they can feel a little nauseous at first as the toxins start to move back into the bloodstream. It's completely normal. They might get a headache or lightheaded sometimes when they're first practicing until their body can adjust to the movement. But again, they're going to feel the same thing. They're going to feel an increase in their energy at first. And what I would recommend in coming to a yoga room is to have fun, keep your sense of humor. Don't get this headspace that you have to be either strong or flexible to do yoga. Know that it's a practice, not a perfect. That means that every day that you get on your mat, you're going to have a brand new experience, a brand new body. The most important thing, though, I would recommend for beginners is to learn alignment, not to go jump into a more athletic class, because what happens is that you can get into really funky habits. Those habits are what makes the body vulnerable, and that can lead to injury, meaning that your body is going to find the most available place for flexibility. I mean, if a teacher says bend that knee, you're going to try to bend that knee no matter what, even if it means collapsing the ankle or dumping into your lower back. So I recommend going to classes where the teacher is literate in the language of alignment, learn how to stack the bones in the most appropriate way so the muscles can then therefore stretch and tone evenly. Then go find, or rather explore, classes that might have a more dynamic rhythm. Maybe the teacher plays music, maybe there's more sun salutes involved, but at least you'll know what you're doing so you can protect your body, so that when you're in these faster paced classes that you don't get hurt, because that's just a bummer.
So what are the common mistakes then that you see people make when they first start out?
In the type of yoga that I teach, which is a more athletic form of yoga, competition. People coming in there and competing or comparing themselves to the person next to them and then pushing too hard, moving too fast because they've set some sort of an unrealistic goal in their own heads. But that's kind of natural. It's also part of the process. You know, the yoga will really reveal to you all the shadow parts of yourself. So if you're competitive in life, it'll show up on the mat, and it gives you a chance to get to heal it there. But at first you kind of have to run through that, burn through it. Eating right before a yoga class, never a good idea. You should give your body an opportunity to digest the food a little bit. Wearing clothing that is just too loose, because what happens is the t-shirt ends up over your head. You want to wear things that are comfortable, but not so baggy that you're just going to have material all over and twisting and just picking at it the whole class. They leave their cell phones on when they come into the yoga class. They don't stay for Shavasana, for the final resting pose, which is probably the most important pose in the class. They all of a sudden they feel like, okay, the workout's over, so now I want to get out of here. But again, part of the process. Hopefully in time they'll realize that it's about the yang and the yin and creating balance, and if they really want the full effects of the experience, they've got to let their body restore. Otherwise they'll leave feeling hyper, not energized. It's a big difference. Or they'll leave feeling depleted, not grounded. Again, big difference. So those are some of the mistakes that I see beginners make. But I don't even like to call it mistakes, because it's just part of it. It's definitely a part of the journey. You kind of figure this out as you go along and backtrack, fix things, and find your practice.
So can you describe a bit more then about the style of yoga that you practice and how is it different to other forms of yoga?
The style of yoga that I practice is called Vinyasa Flow Yoga, and all Vinyasa simply means is linking movement with breath. Why I love this practice, though, is because it's influenced by some very specific traditional practices like Ashtanga, Iyengar, Vinaya Yoga. It's also influenced by tantric philosophies and even contemporary self-help methodologies. Because it doesn't have a guru attached, no one can say to the vinyasa teacher that you're teaching it right or wrong. You can really bring in your own creativity into the practice, and that's what I really respond to. Whereas a lot of the other systems, you are responsible for honoring the lineage, which, believe me, has huge, huge value and is very important. But the vinyasa is a little bit more contemporary and freeform that way. So this practice does a few things, body, mind, and spirit. It strengthens, tones all the various systems of the body. It helps to create more flexibility in the muscles, the joints, the connective tissue. It kind of meets you where you're at. If you're interested in yoga just to get stronger, that's available. If you're interested in yoga because you want to find ways to deal with your stress or your conflicts and crises in a more integrated way, that's available.
So leading on from that then, can you tell me how you actually became a yoga instructor?
I was living in New York City, and I also had a job in a small cafe called Life Cafe, which is down on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And the cafe was owned by a man by the name of David Life, and David went on to open the Jivamukti Yoga Centers, which are a very famous yoga school. Sharon Gannon, his partner at Jivamukti, was a waitress at this restaurant. And so yoga became something I got familiar with. When I was around 19 years old, David and Sharon went off to India, came back all funky and crazy and, happy. And I got very curious. And like I said, I was doing a lot of drugs at that time. And the way that they were expressing yoga was that it was another way to expand your consciousness without actually having to get high. And so that intrigued me. And so I started practicing yoga, and I liked it at first. I didn't love it. I liked it. But what happened is, it suddenly didn't feel good to drink alcohol, and then suddenly it didn't feel good to smoke cigarettes, and suddenly it didn't feel good to do hallucinogens or to have inappropriate sex. Like, over a course of time, it was just things that I enjoyed. It no longer felt good in my body or in my spirit, and so my practice began to evolve. And so I started practicing at 19, but around 24 I got very, very serious. I moved to Los Angeles because at that time I used to smoke pot in Central Park and listen to Led Zeppelin, and there was this song called Going to California, which is a famous song, and there's a line, someone told me there's a girl out there with love in her eyes and flowers in her hair. And I always thought, like, that's me. I'm that girl. I've got to go to California. And in 1994, I started teaching yoga. And it really, as an extension of my practice, I lived and breathed yoga. And one of my teachers had said to me, Seane, a yoga teacher is someone so filled with yoga that it overflows. And I thought, I think that might be me. I don't know how to teach this stuff, but I love to talk about it, and I can't help but express the power of this practice.
So is there anything that you do differently now to when you first started your yoga practice?
Yeah, I'm not crazy. I was nuts when I first started. I was 19 years old, and I was super strong and flexible. So I adapted to the practice of yoga very, very quickly, and I never took a beginner class, threw myself into it. The harder the pose, the better. And I got more injuries as a result of that than I even care to express. So as I matured on my path, I definitely slowed my practice down, incorporated the breath, got more invested in aligning my bones, explored the uninvestigated parts of my flexibility, the denser muscles and connective tissues that hold the most amount of tension, stress, and therefore emotions. Got just smarter about the intensity in which I practiced, because I realized that getting stronger and more flexible was never going to make me happy. Releasing tension was going to make me happier. It was going to make me a more balanced and integrated person. In our cultures, we're addicted to our attention. Our attention is what allows us to maintain this sense of control and therefore separation. We use it as a way to protect ourselves from getting hurt, which is just an illusion. You practice yoga, you release the tension, you feel, you begin to connect to your vulnerability. For a lot of people, that's very, very scary. But that is a natural progression of the practice. You release the tension and you're going to feel. But the beauty of that, it's through your vulnerability that will lead to surrender. So you'll start to live your life not by what you think, by what you know to be true. So not by your head, but by your heart, which is more abstract. And now that I'm more experienced as a yogi, all I want to do is do poses that can help me to maintain my strength and flexibility, help me to release the tension so that I can show up in my life, in my family, and in my work without being motivated by my fear, my rage, my unresolved grief, or my ego, but to be motivated by something much bigger than that, which is my love. I can't do that if I don't practice yoga. I will let my tension overwhelm me very, very quickly. And that's just a game I'm no longer willing to play. So I think that as I've gotten older and more experienced, I'm much more patient. I'm much less surprised by the magic of this practice. And I'm much more open by its possibilities. And I'm much less interested in the power of it, meaning the physical power. That's an aspect. I only want to go deeper into the poses because that's where I'm holding on to some unresolved tension. Not because I necessarily want to get, my legs behind my head. I want to get my legs behind my head so I feel the sensation.
So can you debunk some common myths that people have about yoga?
That just because a person teaches yoga means that they're enlightened or actually knows anything. There are plenty of teachers who are out there that have become yoga teachers because they're strong and they're flexible and they have beautiful practices. But I think it's very important that students should not give their power over to their teachers just because someone can grab their ankles in a back bend. Learn about the person, their life, their intentions, and the quality of their experience before you just completely let them tell you how to live your life. There's a lot of really, messed up yoga teachers out there. There's also a lot of fabulous ones. So it's really important for the student to discern and to take responsibility.
What's your number one insider secret then for improving health and fitness, something that people can take away and do right now?
Well, diet is one of the first things. If they want to improve their health and their wellness right away, stop eating processed foods, let go of anything that's refined, getting rid of foods that have a lot of, that are heavy or dense, like wheat or pasta. You're going to see a huge improvement in your energy right away. Your body just can't process or break that stuff down. And it means that your body is craving nutrients that it's not getting, so your body always feels hungry. So if you clean up your diet right away, you're just going to get on a fast track to good health. Another thing is, if you get it in your head that your yoga practice has to be an hour and a half every single day or six days a week, you're probably going to end up talking yourself out of a good experience. Wake up in the morning, brush your teeth, go into another room, put your palms together, and just start moving and breathing. And if it's 15 minutes of quality practice, great. If it evolves into an hour, wonderful. If it becomes an hour and a half, that's fantastic. But that you don't want to impose it and then beat yourself up because you didn't live up to this expectation. Yoga really is a lifestyle choice. It's about releasing the tension effectively so that you can be more loving and more connected with yourself and with your family. If that takes you 20 minutes to accomplish releasing the tension, that's wonderful. And I watch too many people get turned off to yoga because they can't make time or room for it in their lives and then just stop doing it altogether. And know that this is a practice about empowerment, and that a huge part of this practice, once you start releasing the tension, is about looking at the whole of your life and seeing where are you embodying stress and making conscious choices to eliminate that stress, whether it's in your relationships or in work, and allowing yourself to see a bigger picture If you want the key to happiness, I'll give it to you right now. It's really one word, it's forgiveness. So if you can practice that every single day and commit to it, you're certainly a better yogi than I am. And that's something that everyone can begin to practice starting in this moment. And it doesn't require flexibility, it doesn't require strength, it doesn't require youth. So those would be my keys.
For someone who's a complete beginner, what's the most important thing that you can recommend that they do to make it become a positive habit?
For someone who's a complete beginner, the most important thing that they can do to make it a positive habit would be to find a good teacher that can help support them in this process, that can help develop their self-confidence as well as physiological awareness so that they can do this safely. A good teacher is going to create an environment where you get excited to come in and do your yoga. Also, committing to 3 days a week. After 4 weeks, it becomes a habit. Make that commitment, then odds are it'll end up becoming 5 days a week, you know. But again, if they set the goal too high, they usually will get turned off. So 3 days a week is enough.
What advice would you give to someone who has started practicing yoga and then they've kind of like fallen off the wagon and they've kind of gone off track? How can they get back on track again?
Get back on the mat. That's all you got to do. Just get back on the mat. But it's also part of the process. Over the years, there are many different periods of my experience where I got off the mat, and I had 1,000 reasons why at that moment I couldn't practice. I was traveling too much, or a family member was ill. But in a very short amount of time, I could see how it was affecting my personality or my body. It just felt gross. I wanted to get back on the mat, and once I did, every single time I'm like, why would I even think that I can't do this every single day? Like, why would I even think that's an alternative? And yet, a year later, I'll be off the mat again. So I think for someone who's gotten off the mat, get back on it, put your palms together, breathe deeply, give yourself 10 minutes of moving and integrating the breath, and you're going to feel better. And hopefully it'll have an effect that makes you want to continue this path and bring it into your life every single day.
So can you recount any funny or interesting stories about practicing yoga?
I think the story that I would want to tell you, it's not necessarily a funny story, but it's very, very interesting in relationship with yoga. And it's a different kind of yoga, though. It wouldn't be necessarily what happened in a yoga class. It would be how I first came to understand, really the first lesson I ever had in yoga. And this was when I was 17 years old and I had just first moved to New York City. And when I moved to the city, I did a lot of drugs and alcohol, which is what I liked a lot, especially hallucinogens. And this is before I got into yoga. And I worked in a club called Heaven, and Heaven was an all-male gay sex club. And it was in the city. And I was the only female allowed to work. I was the only female allowed in the club, let alone work there. And I worked behind the bar. And so there's a lot wrong with this story already. I'm underage, working in a gay sex club, and doing a lot of drugs. So almost every single night there was a man that came into this club by the name of Billy. And Billy was an African-American man, very tall, and who was obviously gay. And he, for whatever reason, adored me, absolutely adored me. And he would come in just to see what I was wearing and kind of chide me a little bit about my drug use. But he had a real love for me. And Billy hadn't been in the club maybe about 3 weeks, and which was very unusual. And finally he came back, and I saw him like walk into the club, and he spotted me and made a beeline to the bar. And I went to reach out and hug him, and as I did, I noticed that he had these red sores on his neck and on his shoulder. And so I pulled back and I said to him, "Billy, what is that?" And he said, "Those are manifestations of my disease." And I said, "Well, what disease is that?" And he said, "I have AIDS." So you have to remember this is in 1984, and in 1984 there were only 40 reported cases of HIV, and now, of course, there's 40 million reported cases. So even though I worked in a gay sex club, there was still a lot of ignorance and prejudice and fear around the disease. So when he said that, I recoiled, and I remember Billy being kind of sighing and looking a little sad, and he said to me, Seane, do you want to understand a little bit more about my disease? Now, let me backtrack on Billy a little bit. Billy was raised in Ohio, and when he came out of the closet, he had been married, had children, and he was ostracized by his family, his children, his church. He had been a Baptist. And he moved to New York City so that he could live the rest of his life out living in his truth. And he was a lovely, excited man, but he was also very lonely. So Billy says to me, do you want to understand a little bit more about my disease? So he tells me how he believes he contracted it. I asked him a bunch of questions. Could I get it if he kissed me, if he sweat on me, if we had sex? And he answered all my questions, and I asked him about the treatments, and he told me what was happening to him at that time, and I asked him if there was a cure. And he said, no, there's no cure. There's no cure then, and there's no cure now. So I asked him what was going to happen, and Billy said to me that he was dying. And I asked him if he was afraid, and he said that he wasn't because he had a really strong faith in God. And he then asked me if I believed in God, and I said, well, I don't know. I don't think so. I was not raised to believe in God necessarily, and the God that I had absorbed from my culture was really a patriarchal God that seemed to show up only when you messed up. So I didn't really have a strong belief system one way or the other. So I said, no, I don't think so. So Billy said to me, Seane, do you want to see God right now? So I look around the club, and there's men in drag, and there's a sex room that you can go into. There's men in chains hanging off the wall. So I looked around and I said, yeah, show me God here. So Billy points to Danny the Wonder Pony. And Danny the Wonder Pony was a white man who came into the club every night, butt naked except for chaps and a saddle. And for $1, you can climb on Danny's back, and he would trot around the dance floor, and you can hit him with a switch. So Billy points to Danny and said, God's right there. So then he points to this cross-dresser. This person came into the club also all the time, 6'6", used to wear this light blue house coat, sensible shoes, a gray wig with a hat and a veil, and a pocketbook like my grandma would wear. The ugliest cross-dresser in New York City. And so Billy said, God's right there. And then Billy points to two gentlemen arguing in a booth. They're both wearing business suits and looked as straight as my brothers. And Billy said, and God's there. And then Billy takes his hand, this huge mitt of a hand, and he puts it right on my chest. And he takes his hand, my hand, and he puts it on his chest. And he says to me, and Seane, God's right here. And he says to me, Seane, I'm going to tell you something. And I hope you can remember this for the rest of your life. And Billy says to me, Seane, ignore the story and see the soul. And remember to love, you will never regret it. Ignore the story and see the soul. And remember to love, you will never regret it. So that was my very first lesson in yoga. And what Billy was basically telling me then, and it's what I still believe now, is not to get too caught up in the story or the personality of a human being, but to look deeper into their soul's journey and understand that all beings are doing what they can with what they know, opening their hearts to learn what love and truth and God is. And each person will do it in their own way and in their own time, and therefore in God's time. And so that was my very, very first lesson in yoga. I didn't actually get on the yoga mat until another 2 years later. But I realize now that angels show up in very peculiar ways. And in my experience in yoga after all these years is that every single moment conspires to evolve your soul and to open your heart, and not to be so arrogant that you miss the messengers just because they don't look the way that you think perhaps they're supposed to look. I look back at it now and think, how perfect. An angel showed up to me in a gay club called Heaven, for God's sakes, called Heaven, to teach me what it was to love and to really what yoga is, which means that we're all one. So that's not necessarily a funny story, but I think it's the story to me that best illustrates my experience with yoga and how surreal my journey, my own particular journey has been, and and how perfect.
Well, it's been fantastic talking to you today. You've given us some really inspiring stuff, and I know that our audience is going to get a lot of value from this. So, thanks so
And I
much
hope
for
so.
sparing us the time today.
Oh, you're very, very welcome.